Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I wanted to talk a little bit about well, what is uh Pride Month for the LGBT community, and what is the Stonewall riots in 1969, and what is the Stonewall Inn? The Stonewall Inn was a club for members of the LGBT community that existed from the 1920s to the 1960s. And basically, it was a mob club. It was owned by the Mafia. It was owned by the Genovese crime family. And it was in the Greenwich Village area of New York City. And the Mafia basically looked the other way when it came to this kind of activity that was illegal at the time, because at the time there was sodomy laws on the books with regards to the gay community. If somebody was caught being in the gay community at that time, they were arrested and imprisoned, and sometimes they were even killed. So during this night on June 28th, 1969, um, cops that night were particularly getting really under the skin of a lot of patrons, and they had been busting um, patrons for months and months. A string of them. Sometimes they would get busted like 50 of them, 60 of them at a time. And of course, being in the summer, it was really really hot. And plus, Judy Garland had just passed away. Judy Garland, of course, the star of The Wizard of Oz, and many movies of the 1930s and 40s. And at the time when no one was gay friendly, she was considered gay friendly. In fact, a euphemism for a lot of gay men at the time, back in the day, was called a friend of Dorothy. In other words, that a reference to the movie of The Wizard of Oz. Judy Garland was an icon in the gay community, still an icon in the gay community, and her portrayal in The Wizard of Oz, her character's longing for somewhere over the rainbow in the song in The Wizard of Oz, was an inspiration to a lot of people struggling with their sexuality that felt they didn't have a place to belong. So her death on this night, while it didn't trigger the riots, it is a myth that her death triggered the riots. Her death caused the riots. It precipitated to the environment of frustration in the community, because they were mourning this person that they considered a hero in their community, and the cops were fucking with them. There's no other way to put it. The cops were coming down on them hard in their place of sanctuary. So finally, people can't take it, and a trans woman by the name of Marsha P. Johnson and another trans woman by the name of Sylvia Rivera, yes, two trans women of color, finally had enough, and Marsha P. Johnson throws the rock through the window, and she begins a riot that went on for several days until until July. I think until July 4th, and then um, marks a period in history where the gay movement turns the corner, where legislation is then put in place to not only legalize um, LGBT relations between women and men, but also to decriminalize it and to legalize it, but also to legitimize it in our society. Later on in San Francisco, the banner is created. Okay, Lisa, July 3rd. Thank you. So Lisa is absolutely right. I'm off by a day. It wasn't Independence Day. It was July 3rd. But the point is, they began to legitimize it in a lot of people's eyes because in a lot of people's eyes before that, like I said, the sodomy laws. And sodomy is, of course, a reference to the biblical verse, Sodom and Gomorrah, which a lot of religious people, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, use to condemn. They use the story of Sodom and Gomorrah to condemn homosexuality. So there was a lot of laws on the books condemning sexual behavior, especially between men and men. And because of this riot, a lot of those laws get repealed. Harvey Milk is then elected in the 1970s to office, and it starts the ball rolling, much in the same way that um, the Montgomery bus boycott started the ball rolling in the civil rights movement. And in a way, the gay liberation movement and the gay rights movement was inspired in a lot of ways by the civil rights movement and by second wave feminism. They all kind of coalesced at the same time. You had the civil rights movements, then you had the Black Power movements, then you had the gay liberation movements. There were people in there that were all three. But the Stonewall is the event that sparked the flame. It is to the gay liberation movement and to the gay rights movement exactly what um, the Boston Massacre is to the American Revolution, or like I said, the Montgomery bus boycott is to the civil rights movement. So it gets the ball rolling, and then and then we have officially Pride Month, where we celebrate the sacrifices of many people who had to go underground, writers and stuff who had to keep their sexualities hidden, like famous people like Oscar Wilde or Walter Whitman, famous poets had to keep their sexualities hidden because of social stigma and oppression. And people think that it ended with Oprah, which is the landmark court case in 2014, which legalized gay marriage throughout the country. But that's still not the end of it. There is still persecution, especially of the trans community, especially in the Black and Latino trans community, where there is a greater stigmatization of homosexuality. I think because of the overly religious things. Lisa was telling me earlier that um, she was watching a thing in this graduation that this kid went to. I mean that this kid gave a speech that he was a valedictorian, and all of a sudden his mic was cut off in mid speech because he was talking about his coming out story. And this is 2021 in New Jersey, in a seemingly liberal state. But even in New Jersey, even in a seemingly liberal state like New Jersey, you still have those kinds of prejudices and those kind of biases against, you know, um, just letting people live their lives, man, and letting people love who they want to love. Like the slogan goes after Oprah, love wins because love was stronger than hate at that point. And I've spoken about this before in other videos. Love is stronger than hate. But at that time, Stonewall riots was a lot of hate. But I always found it interesting too that the Mafia was pretty cool with the gay community, or looked the other way because yes, exactly. Yes, it was owned by the Genovese crime family, and the Genovese crime family is the crime family in real life. If you watch the show Godfather of Harlem, the man who's the head of the Genovese crime family in that show was the real head of the Genovese crime family in real life in the 60s and 70s. Vincent de Cinqueganti, who was very famous and infamous, just like he is on the show, where he walks around in a bathrobe and he walks around Greenwich Village. He was the head of the Greenwich Village um, branch of that. In fact, Tony Salerno was the head of the Harlem branch. He was also featured on the show. But yeah, it was owned by the Stonewall Inn. I was just gonna say that, Lisa, that it was crazy that the mob. You would think the mob would be all about machismo and against homosexuality, but not necessarily, because you got to remember the Stonewall Inn was established um, during Prohibition, and it was established as a speakeasy. And what people know as what is a speakeasy is during Prohibition, the 18th Amendment was passed. The 18th Amendment outlawed the production or sale of alcohol in this country until the 1930s. So, in order to drink alcohol, you had to open up these secret clubs, and people would say a secret code word, and they would say it softly. They would speak easy, and they would say this code word, and they would be able to go into these underground clubs. And the mafia owned all these clubs, and the mafia was heavily involved in the production of alcohol. So, even after the 1930s, when the 20th Amendment was passed, and alcohol was legalized, of course, the mafia would engage in other underground activities. Like I said in my boxing video, the one on Mayweather and Jake Paul. So, seeing as though LGBT activity was an underground activity that was against the law because of these sodomy laws, even though the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, used to dress in dresses and was a bisexual, it was still criminalized. It's no surprise, in a way, if you think about it, that the mafia would be involved with this. Not necessarily that they support gay rights or anything, but that they are involved in something that is illegal, something that is underground, because that's the nature of the mafia. They are engaged in underground illicit activities. you know, Things that the society at large considers not on the level. So yeah, Lisa, and the heavy pushers behind the Stonewall riots. There was a movie about it a couple of years back, but again, um, this movie was very whitewashed. This movie does not mention that the pushers behind it, the woman who started it, women who started it, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, were the ones who started it. So it kind of is like um, the Boston Massacre in a way. Just how Crispus Attucks started the Boston Massacre, and he was black. Marsha P. Johnson was a black trans woman, and she doesn't get the credit in the same way that you know the white guy who didn't even exist gets the credit in the whitewash movie on the Stonewall riot. So, um, once again, people of color pushed to the background, not really at the forefront, of this kind of stuff as they should be. So even in Pride Month, there is still some racism and still some prejudice. And I know this is a separate video, but I wanted to bring this up. If anyone has a problem with my discussions, my frank discussions on race and ethnicity in this page, and they continue to leave troll comments like under the Juneteenth video, you can just delete yourself from my page, because I will not be tolerating racism, homophobia, or any kind of phobia as it is us as human beings still have a long way to go. You know, we have Juneteenth, we have this the Pride Month, we have the Stonewall riots, we have freedom to recognize. But we still have a long way to go when it comes to freedom. So, um, yeah, I could, what I encourage you to check out on this, check out a couple of you, check out the YouTube video on Marsha P. Johnson. Her life was very tragic and sad because not only was she a trans woman, but she's being a trans woman of color, and trans women of color are still um, the number one targeted hate group in this country. Yes, Lisa, that is true. They didn't have, at that time. They didn't have liquor licenses, so that was the reason they gave. But also vagrancy was another reason. You know, hanging around, loitering. But they needed an official reason to bust them, and that's absolutely right that it was vagrancy. Because as I mentioned, alcohol was still, even after prohibition, alcohol was still heavily regulated. So, and you need heavy liquor licenses here in New York City, even to this day. So they can't really bust them because they're having sex, you know, guys having sex with guys or whatever, because you need proof of that. So much like in the Islamic countries, when they bust you for sexual crimes, they'll bust you on something else, right? Instead of that, as a precursor, they can't really get you on that because how can they really? But can they bust you really having sex? No, they can't. That's a private thing. So they gotta bust you on some other kind of legality. Um, So they use some bullshit excuse, knowing that it used to be a speakeasy, knowing the heavy alcohol laws, especially knowing that it has mob ties. That was the biggest thing with it, because of that mob ties, they wanted to bust it too. Having ties to the mob, of course, they want to bust that because you know, for the longest time since the mob was established, up until when John Gotti got locked up in 1999, the mob was the biggest thorn in the side to NYPD. Did anyone die in the riots? Yes, I think. I looked that up actually. So I don't actually know if there were any deaths in the riots. Okay. Yes, 45 people were killed. Lisa. 45 people. Um, it cost the city over $1 billion at that time in that time's money. But it's just crazy because t- tensions were so high in the 60s. Um, I talked about 1968 in the video I did on the Olympic guy that died with the fist. In the video I did on the Chicago 7, 1969 was just as hot, just as crazy because not only did you have this, but you had the Manson murders. You know, the 60s is always a crazy time for me to study because the way our world is today was shaped completely by the 60s. Like the movements and stuff we consider important today were shaped by the 1960s. You know what I mean? So, yeah, 54 people. Isn't that crazy? Hmm. You know, of course, let me look up when Pride Month started. So yeah, it started to be recognized, I think, by the 1990s. Uh, you know, LGBT visibility after the dark period that was the AIDS epidemic, which I talked about in my 1980s video. Um,
You know the movie Flying? I had a good movie. Is there a way that you could go on a list and see the movies you watch?
yeah,
Yeah. Fine. You show it.
yeah,
Oh, are you doing a video?
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That's all right. Um, yeah. So yeah, is that what they say, Lisa? I, that's what I always heard. So I don't know. Maybe that could be a myth. Yeah, that could be a myth. But that's what I always heard, that it was one of the impetus for the riots, and it makes kind of sense to me. I mean, how do you really know what's in people's mind? You know? Okay, they say it's not true. Okay, I stand corrected. That was always a common myth. Maybe there are myths that accrue around historical events. We don't really know. I'm saying what was in people's minds. Her death was June 28th, 1969. I mean June 27th, 1969, and the riots happened in June 28th, 1969. So it makes sense that is the reason. But as you say, it could be not the reason. I'm reading a lot of websites too where it says it's not. But unless you were in the mind of the people that were there that day, it's hard to really say what the reason was. It could be a tipping point that would cause a riot. For example, yeah, maybe they're not. I mean, nobody is saying that they were rioting because of her. I mean that she passed away, but just the frustration of her passing away and her being such an icon within that community, you know, and being so beloved by that community, and a lot of symbolism with her movies, especially Wizard of Oz, and her being married to a guy that was gay, you know, uh, like for example, in history they record that snowballs being thrown at the British shoulders was um, really caused the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Now you're not gonna really blame that on snowballs, but it's just that everything is happening all at once, right, Lise? And the frustration of the community is building up, and they just lost this person that means so much to them. That them herself was married to somebody who was a member of the LGBT community, Vincent Minnelli, the director, who was the father of Liza Minnelli, her daughter. Um, that she means so much to them, and she's just passed away, and they're mourning her. And now the police, the cops are fucking with them. That could be in something too. It didn't necessarily cause that, but it was a coincidence, like you said, that happened at the same time. They didn't riot because of her. It's not called the Judy Garland riots. It's called the Stonewall riots, and it was a riot for LGBT rights. It wasn't a riot for Judy Garland. You know what I mean? But she became a symbol for their resistance. her death, like her death was symbolic. It's kind of like with George Floyd. They weren't really necessarily rioting because of George Floyd, right? Some of the people were rioting in their own cities for their own reasons, but they used George Floyd as a symbol. He's a symbol of the rebellion. Yeah, I mentioned Marsha P. Johnson, Lisa, and watch her documentary. She is her story. Her and Sylvia Rivera, their story is very tragic, especially hers. Um, just because she was so full of life. Um, she was so full of life in the documentary. I'll post the link. That to me, she's the real symbol. Yes, Judy Garland is the famous face or whatever the impetus for it, but Marsha P is the real symbol. Marsha P is she's the Crispus Attucks of this um the documentary is called The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson, who was who came it came out in 2017. So yeah, Lisa corrected me on a few things about the Judy Garland thing, but I I still say that she stood for uh, she stood for LGBT freedom, and she's a symbol of LGBT awareness and pride. Even though she didn't have anything direct, her death that they weren't writing for her was bigger than her. Because she was married to a gay guy, and she stood out for the LGBT community at a time when nobody really did. She was an icon in that way. No, I'm not saying you're wrong, Lisa. I'm not saying you're wrong. You're absolutely right. I've read that too. That it is an urban myth that her death caused it. I think when they retell the history, like when they retell all history, they're leaving out certain key statements. So the fact that you bring that up, thank you, Lisa, for bringing that up because that is true. Her death did not cause the riots, but it was something that was going on at the time that was important in that community, and it, it's not really mentioned. And still the rainbow and the symbols in Oz, the boy from Oz and stuff. The symbols associated with the Wizard of Oz are still important in the LGBT community's liberation. So, yeah, the kid I was talking about that Lisa told me about, as Sheik says in the comments, his mic turned off. He was able to remember it by memory. Like I was telling her, he didn't become a valedictorian for nothing. Some people like Lisa, they have sharp memories. You know, but anyway, guys, I'm gonna go. But again, check out the Marshall P. Johnson documentary. I'll put a link in the description box. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell. And thank you, Lisa, for the input because I don't always get everything right, man. I get a lot of stuff. I know the version of the story that I've heard, and I like to shed light on it. But if anybody has any other information that's conflicted with that or different than that, then that's cool, man. That's what I live for. I live for interaction. I live to be corrected, man, because We learn every day, man. You know what I mean? Peace.